Welcome to episode 89 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes and I'm in the centre of Bradford, the UK City of Culture 2025, and more specifically I'm in the middle of a very noisy centenary square just beside the magnificent Gothic town hall. It's noisy because of all the fountains around me. I caught the train this morning from Halifax to avoid the hill mainly, between Halifax and Bradford. And my plan is to head up into the Dales, only for a couple of days, making the most of the nice weather we've got at the moment in the middle of April. I'll be camping near Appletreewick, so in a few minutes I'm going to be setting off to find the Leeds-Liverpool canal to Skipton and then continue slightly further north to Appletreewick. We're also in this podcast, apart from hearing about my short trip to the Dales, we're going to be hearing from three people who have contributed monologues to the podcast in recent months. It won't just be me you're hearing from, you'll also be hearing from three other cyclists. So without further ado, I'm going to head off in the direction of the cycle track that will take me initially to Shipley, Saltaire, Bingley, and eventually Skipton and the Yorkshire Dales. Just north of Bradford, continuing to head north. First time visitors to Bradford must be a bit surprised because it's got a reputation as being a run-down, grimy northern city, but actually there's a lot going for it. I mentioned the Gothic architecture of the town hall. There are quite a few buildings in the city centre which are just magnificent. The standout example is now a branch of Waterstone. There's the old corn exchange, which it could quite easily be found in Florence. It's just a magnificent building. And they've just pedestrianised the entire city centre, so there are no cars to contend with. And from the perspective of a cyclist, it's a great place to start a visit to the Yorkshire Dales because there's a segregated off-road cycle route all the way from the city centre, which takes you to Shipley, stop off at Saltaire if you want for Salts Mill, and then it joins the canal, which is what I'm going to be doing in a few minutes. But apart from the train station in Bradford, which is a run-down hellhole, certainly the interchanges, the other one is a little bit better at Foster Square. It's got a lot going for it, and as a starting point for heading north into the Dales, well, yes, you can get the train further north to Skipton, but the cycle from Bradford to Skipton is well worth considering, and it's what I'm about to do. Continuing to head north, I've just passed through Bingley and Keighley is to my left. In Bingley, the canal, it goes up quite a bit. There's a set of 3 locks, and then there are a set of 5 locks, and north of Bingley the canal just clings to the side of the hill. I can't imagine, well, perhaps I can imagine why. Perhaps there was too much stuff in the bottom of the valley, or perhaps it just made life more convenient further north en route to Liverpool if it maintained this level. Who knows? I'm a fan of canal engineering, especially after having cycled along all those canals in France. in 2022 on the Grand Tour. But they're fantastic places to cycle. Loads and loads of cyclists and walkers and runners today, with it being such a beautiful day. And it's amazing how many people live right next to the canal on the side of the hill, ranging from council estates to really quite substantial, very luxurious homes. But with the canal being on the side of the valley, if I look to my left, I get some great views. If you ignore Keighley College, which is a bit of an eyesore. I had a couple of nice encounters with fellow cyclists at Bingley Five Rise Locks at the cafe there, where I had a bacon butter. Well, I say nice, one was a bit kind of he made some sarcastic comment about why I was travelling with a tent and panniers, mocking me. "Are you going to the moon?" he said. Well, of course I'm not going to the moon. But the other chap was a lot more friendly, asking me where I was going, wishing me good luck. Seemed very, very chatty. So he was a nice chap to meet. Oh, the path does get a bit rough sometimes. It's a bit like the Canal du Midi. Well, not quite as bad as that. Now, talking of encounters with cyclists, I think it's time for the first of the 3 monologues. Come on in.
Hello, my name is Justin Shiels. I'm 65 years of age and I'm lucky enough to live in the fabulous town of Kendal with my wife, Chris, in the south of the Lake District. Previously, we lived most of our working lives in the city of York, and then I was brought up in the city of Bristol. My cycling has spanned 50 odd years, and I've been through various stages, carbon, lycra, speed, etc. Now for me, cycling is very much about the journey. I think it's a fantastic means of travelling through a country. Welcome to my garden is what I want to talk about today. Some of you, I'm sure, will have heard of Welcome to My Garden, and I want to start by saying that I have absolutely no affiliation to Welcome to My Garden. However, I might be able to benefit by doing this monologue, as I'll explain at the end. Basically, Welcome to My Garden works much the same as warm showers, except rather than being offered a bed or a room, you're offered a patch in someone's garden. The history of it is not very old, it dates back to the COVID pandemic and to Belgium, where apparently the regulations there permitted someone to go and camp in someone else's garden, provided they weren't in direct contact with them. The 2 people who set up Welcome to My Garden, whose name, forgive my Belgian pronunciation, are Manon and Dries, I'm sure that's terrible, set up an app so people could locate where they could go and travel to and stay. So there's an app which I'm also guessing has developed over time, which has the mapping facility in it is really very good. I like it a lot, and particularly I like the feature where you can tick a box and it shows the cycle routes in a particular part, and it will show the national routes, the international routes, the Eurovela routes and local routes, etc. So it all works very neatly. Who is Welcome to My Garden for? Well, they stipulate pretty clearly you have to arrive as a guest, you have to arrive at a host's place as either on foot or on a bicycle or a tricycle, I guess, or a monocycle or unicycle or whatever. You get the idea. So how does it work? You look at your map, you look and see what the host is offering and see if it matches your needs. The minimum a host can offer is a patch of ground. They can also offer electricity, water, showers, toilets, any number of things. They might even offer a room. They might offer tea, They might offer anything. It's very much up to the individual, which brings me on to really what I like about Welcome to My Garden. And I like it both as a host and as a guest. As a host, it gives me total control over the situation. I can just point someone at the garden and say, there you are, you camp there, Kendal Town Centre is down the road 500 metres, enjoy your stay. What actually happens in reality is people come, they stay, they have a shower, they use for the facilities we offer. We have a part of the house which we can section off so they can use the toilet and things like that. And then we normally end up sitting in the garden, drinking beer and talking about travels by bicycle. In particular their travel, because they are normally on a journey. As a guest, I also like that because I don't feel I'm imposing on them, on the host. That makes me more comfortable with my stay. Again, it's kind of up to both parties to work out how much time they will spend together, but I feel I have some control over that. The cost of joining Welcome to My Garden is €30 per year, and that gives you access to the mapping, which I think is actually accessible without being a subscriber. It means you're able to contact the host so you can actually plan a journey. The people behind the project or the app, Dries and Manon, I have no idea about them, but they do seem to be genuine people. They're definitely cycle tourists. There's a website and a chat forum and messaging, and people put their stories of where they've travelled and how they've used Welcome to My Garden as part of their travels. Where is it available then? So Belgium is obviously where the project started, and there are in Belgium 3,200 gardens available. Now I think Belgium's not a particularly large country, so that is an extremely high density, which must mean that for Belgian cyclists they have lots of choice about where they can stay. Just some other random figures I took from the website, from the app. Netherlands 91, France 800, that's pretty good. And in Europe in total there are 4,600. Further afield, USA 150, and just some others I quickly noted down that were other places. Place like Australia there are some, but there's Vietnam, India, and then this one really did catch my eye, Somalia. I wonder what that would be like, staying in someone's garden in Somalia. I'm sure it'd be a fantastic experience for all sorts of reasons. So I think that outlines what Welcome to My Garden is all about. I hope it has. So I'll come back to where I started, which is why am I doing this monologue. In the UK and Ireland, there are only 150 gardens available, which personally, considering the population, I think is a bit thin on the ground. And I'm hoping that this is something that will grow. And coming to the selfish element of it, when I cycle, I want to go where I want to go, and it would be great if I can go travel in where I'm going, and to have plenty of choice about how far I go on a certain day or how far I go off my route. So my motivation is to try and build the network in the UK. Well, as I said, Chris and we're in Kendal. Welcome to my garden. I hope to see some of you have subscribed and come and stay with us in Kendal. It's a fantastic place. Thank you. Bye.
I arrived at a dead end. Well, kind of. There's a big metal fence in the middle of the towpath in Silsden, and it says Silsden to Kildwick towpath improvements, improving the Leeds and Liverpool Canal towpath for everyone. From March 2025 for approximately 16 weeks. I can't cycle down here. It is no longer on the National Cycle Network. I think that finished just north of Keighley. I haven't seen any signs, and yeah, well, I suppose it gives me a reason to come back in the future and see what it's like once they've improved it. But it does mean I'm going to have to find an alternative route, which, yeah, I might have to resort to Google. Back on the towpath. Google didn't really help. It wanted to send me on the main road that you can still hear just to my left. So instead I went over the canal, along the old Skipton road, through quite a steep housing estate that brought me back onto the Skipton road, and a very pleasant ride back down to the canal at the point where they're no longer doing the improvements. And it's about 4 miles up until I get to Skipton. And again, it's just a beautiful, beautiful location. Although the road you can hear to my left is a bit annoying, to my right it's just a gently inclined hill full of sheep, some beautiful houses. This is where the affluent of West Yorkshire probably come and hide away at the weekends. Gorgeous. Short pause in Skipton to go to the bank and just to sit and watch the world go by in the churchyard. And I'm now at another church. This one is in Empsey with Eastby. I think that's 2 villages that have kind of merged into one over the years. It is picture perfect, and it's beautiful weather, and it's warm. I've de-layered. I'm now down to 3 layers rather than 4 that I set off with, and I needed those at the beginning of the day, but I certainly don't need 3 now, so it may be a case of de-layering again in a few minutes. I'm now following the Yorkshire Dales cycleway with its distinctive ram signage. It's not part of the National Cycle Network, but I suspect I might be following it quite a bit over the next couple of days, and I'm certainly going to be following it as far as Appletreewick, or kind of nearly. I think I've got a branch off it to get to Appletreewick itself, but I've got a hill to climb. I can see it in the distance, and I'm beginning to regret not having something to eat in Skipton. I'm going to have to survive on that bacon butty that I had when I was in Bingley. Saturday morning, 7 a.m, Mason's campsite, Appletreewick. It's very cold. I suppose that's what comes with going camping in the middle of April, even if it is very, very warm during the middle of the day, which it certainly was yesterday. It was a steep climb out of Empsey, more than I expected. Good views from the top of the hill, and then a gradual downward cycle towards Burnsall. I've done it before, but clearly I've completely forgotten what it's like to cycle up from Empsey and then down into Burnsall. Burnsall is in quite a spectacular setting, and there were hundreds of people in the fields next to the river yesterday afternoon, making the most of the sun. I just went and had a pint of beer in the pub before later in the afternoon making my way down to Appletreewick, which is not very far, set up the tent, and then went up to the other pub, the Derwent Arms, for a burger and chips and another beer. I really am unsure as to what I'm going to do. I'm not going to cycle, but I'm really unsure as to what I'm going to do today. And the plan for tomorrow, as it stands, is to cycle back to Skipton for the parkrun. I've been doing the parkrun now since, autumn of last year, and I thought, this is an opportunity of doing a parkrun elsewhere other than the one in Greenhead Park in Huddersfield. But whether I can get back to Skipton in time, I would need to be there about 8:30. And it took me a good hour and a half to get to Appletreewick from Skipton yesterday. So I have to think carefully. That hill in the opposite direction is no mean feat. I might have to find an alternative route, but that's still the plan for tomorrow. So while I continue to think about what I'm going to do today, I think it's time for the second monologue.
Hello, my name's Neal Porter, and I'd like to tell you a bit about a cycle ride I completed in July 2024 around the coast of mainland Britain. I'm 66 and I retired in 2018 and live in Selby, North Yorkshire. I had always had it in my mind that once I'd retired I would walk around the mainland coast of Britain. But I played rugby for many years and suffered injuries to my knees which were now showing significant wear and tear, so much so that my knees would not get me round. I decided that I would cycle around the coast instead. When I did retire, I quickly got distracted with heavy-duty outdoor volunteering, both with North Yorkshire Moors and with Fix the Fells over in the Lake District. It was in fact COVID lockdowns that gave me the time to think seriously about the ride and then to plan it. Life in retirement was busy with 2 dogs, grandchildren and my volunteering. I didn't feel that I could just clear off on my own for 3 to 4 months. So I decided that I would do the ride in stages, each of between 400 to 600 miles, over 12 to 13 days of cycling at a time. I reckoned that the total distance would be between 4,000 and 5,000 miles, so that 8 to 10 mini adventures of around 500 miles each would get me round. We've got a camper van so that Sue, my wife, would be able to come along with the dogs, and whilst I cycled each day, she would explore the area and have her own non-cycling adventure. When Sue could not come with me, then I'd camp. I would start the ride at the north end of the Humber Bridge and turn south so as to be able to finish the ride down the Yorkshire coast, and also on the basis that the east and south coasts would be relatively less hilly, which would ease me into the hillier stages that were likely to come. As far as I'm aware, there's no official route for cycling around the mainland coast of Britain, so I set myself 4 basic rules for planning the route. 1, to try and cycle as close to the coast as possible. 2, to keep off main roads as much as possible. 3, to use the National Cycle Network as much as possible. 4, to apply common sense to rules 1 to 3. I use Komoot to plan the route for each stage and then to navigate on the ride. I recorded each day's ride so as to be able to compare the planned route and mileage with the actual route and mileage. If a stage was generally less hilly, I planned to cycle on average around 45 miles each day, and on hillier stages 38 to 40 miles each day. When Sue was with me in the camper van, we would need to book campsites ahead of each stage. So having decided the sort of daily mileage and set the route, I then had to try and find campsites either on or close to the route. This often proved pretty difficult, with an available campsite perhaps some way off the route or further along the route than my daily cycling target, so that one day I might cycle 50 to 60 miles and the next day 35 to 40 miles. Even when Sue wasn't with me with the camper van, I booked campsites ahead, as having a place to aim for suited my mentality. I wanted to cycle every day, so there were no planned rest days at all throughout the whole of the ride. And there ended up being only one day when I didn't ride, and that was not my choice and frustrated the hell out of me. Excursions, detours, rides to and back from campsites away from the route added to the planned mileage, but I had all day to ride and to get to the next campsite. So it never really stressed me that I was doing more mileage than I planned. Each day and probably each hour, the question crack on or stop and sit, or stop and go off and have something to look at, something of interest, or have something to eat. That was the question all the time. And you can guess that the weather played a big part in those decisions each day. I'd used a Dawes Audax sport bike when I cycled Land's End to John O'Groats before and for Way of the Roses, but we weren't carrying much then, and I was worried that it wouldn't have enough low gear inches to cope with the climbing that was going to come and the loads. After some research, I settled on a Genesis Tour de Fer 20. It's got flat handlebars, and these could easily be replaced with touring bars, although in the end I settled for ergo grips with adjustable bar ends, which proved great in giving plenty of hand options. The bike came with quality front and rear racks, Schwalbe Marathon tyres, a dynamo hub which powered good lighting, and the components were uncomplicated, they're robust and reliable, apart from, I would say, the cable disc brakes and in particular the resin pads, which wore down really quickly and were easily contaminated. They needed adjusting probably almost every day to try and get the best out of them, and they're made for some pretty stressful cycling, particularly in the wet. Separately, and in circumstances deserving their own stories, the front brake and then the rear brake were swapped out en route for entry-level Shimano hydraulic brake sets, which were a complete revelation to me and an absolute joy. Most importantly with the Genesis, it had really good low gear inches, which I knew I'd need to get me up the hills. The ride would be round the mainland coast of Britain. I'd leave Northern Ireland and most of the various islands for future tours in their own right, but there were 2 islands I would visit on the ride. I got the ferry from Lochaline to Fishnish on Mull and then cycled up to Tobermory before getting the ferry to Kilcohen on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, so as to be able to visit the lighthouse at the point without having a long section of cycling back on myself. And as there's no coastal route between Mallaig and the Kyle of Lochaush that I could find, I took the ferry from Mallaig to Armadale on Skye and cycled the Sleep Peninsula before heading back to the mainland over the Skye Bridge. There would be 27 ferries in total on the ride, and they ranged from the little motorboat for the crossing of the River Blythe at Wobbleswick to the commuter ferry across the Thames between Tilbury and Gravesend, and from the ferry platform with its tugboats over the River Dart between Kingsware and Dartmouth to the various Calmac ferries of the West Islands of Scotland. I really loved the ferries. They always added a bit of tension to the day's ride, especially if there was more than one ferry I had to get in the day. They provided a lovely distraction, and the views from the water were always spectacular. Now, with the decision to do the ride in stages, I felt I needed something that would commit me to completing the ride. It might be just too tempting to ride 1 or 2 stages and then not get back to it, if there was nothing really at stake. So I decided to raise money for charity. Sue's mum, Frida, had died of motor neuron disease, and there had been high-profile rugby players who had fallen to the disease. Doddy Weir and Rob Burrows had done fantastic work in raising awareness of MND and funds for motor neuron disease research before their deaths, and now Ed Slater, a Gloucester rugby player with a young family, has the disease. I'd try and raise some funds for Motor Neuron Disease Association, and so Neal's Bike Round Britain for MND was born. I set up a Just Giving page, and in the build-up to each stage and on every day of each stage, I posted to Instagram and Facebook with stories from the day, photos and information about the sights and sounds of the route. There was a fantastic response to the postings, with donations over each stage flooding in, and which really blew me away and really encouraged me. I was so grateful for all those that followed the ride online and all the good news messages and all the encouragement. They really helped to keep me going. Now, I needed a name for my bike. I decided to call her Gertie. This was, in fact, the made-up name that I called Sue's mum, as I could never really call her mum or by her first proper name, Frida. So, at the beginning of September 2021, Gertie and me set off across the Humber Bridge. Stage 1 in September 2021 turned out to be 640 miles in 14 days from the Humber Bridge to Worthing, West Sussex, with a lot of promenade and seawall riding. It was a great introduction to the ride. In April 2022, Stage 2 was 490 miles in 12 days of riding from Worthing to Newquay, and which saw me round the corner at Land's End with plenty of hills in the Cornish section. In July that year, Stage 3 was 500 miles in 12 days from Newquay to Newport in Pembrokeshire. The south and west of Wales and the coastline is great, and I loved the interspersing between industry and coast. It was lovely. Stage 4 in September the same year was 600 miles in 13 days of riding from Newport to Gretna. So I got into Scotland on that stage. I loved the Cumbrian coast and also the coast up from Liverpool. I planned to complete the ride in 2023, but this didn't work out. As in March 2023, I had my first knee replacement. I had a great rehab and was back on my bike and volunteering within 12 weeks. And I planned to get back to the ride in July, only then to fall to a massive attack of cellulitis in the calf and foot of the same leg as the knee replacement. This put me in hospital for over 2 weeks and then 4 weeks on crutches at home. Now, I was determined to get back to the ride and to cycle at least one stage in 2023. And I made plans to get back to it in the middle of September. So travelled back to Gretna to ride Stage 5, which will be 450 miles in 12 days of riding, to Oban. And in what turned out to be the worst weather of the whole ride. I rode into Oban on the last day of that stage in the teeth of Storm Agnes with heavy rain, very strong gusting winds and exhausted. Stage 5 was, to say the least, very character building. But despite the weather, the scenery and landscapes were absolutely lovely, fantastic. And there were a real warm-up act for what was to come in Stage 6. In April 2024, Stage 6 saw me cycling 445 miles in 12 days from Oban to Scowry, which is just 30 miles short of Durness in the northwest corner of the Highlands. This was by far the hardest stage of the ride, with climbing of nearly 31,000 feet in 12 days. It was also the most spectacular stage, with every day's ride serving up at least one heart-stopping, jaw-dropping wow moment. And on some days, they just kept coming mile after mile. I was now on the North Coast 500 route, sharing roads with the inevitable troops of motorcycles and motorhomes. But nothing could dim my spirit as I cycled through these incredible, spectacular landscapes. It really was gobsmacking. Before cycling Stage 6, I decided that I would ride the last 1,000 miles from Scowry back to the Humber Bridge in one last stage. So in mid-June, I headed back to Scowry. I planned to get the ferry across to the Durness Sound to cycle out to and back from the lighthouse on Cape Wrath, along the road that had been constructed in the 1700s when the lighthouse was built. It was really my bad luck that Scottish Highland Highways had decided at that time to carry out much needed repairs to the single track Cape Wrath Road, and that the ferryman earned more operating the JCB on the Cape Wrath Road repairs than he did on the ferry. So there was no ferry, and that was my one and only enforced rest day. Stage 7, the last 1,000 miles, turned out to be the last 1,120 miles in 26 days, riding from Scowry back to the Humber Bridge. I was camping for most of this last stage and absolutely loved it. I really loved that I was self-contained, that I had everything I needed. I'd pop into a shop to get some lunch stuff. I'd pop into a shop to get something for tea. It was all very, very stressless and really enjoyable. I really enjoyed the daily routines of packing up and pitching the tents and getting meals and sorting myself out. There was only me to please. I had long conversations with myself, but it was great. I loved it. And the Scottish east coast of Scotland was brilliant, with all its little coastal villages and harbours. I think I visited most of them. Before I knew it, though, I'd left Scotland behind and was back in England and riding down the beautiful Northumberland coast. And before I knew it, I was back in Yorkshire. I really didn't want this ride to end. Being on the bike for just short of a month was brilliant and an absolute joy, and I think I just found my happy place. Now, whilst I enjoyed the cycling on my own, I did ride one day from Scarborough to Bridlington with my friend Mark. we did actually have a lovely day's ride, and we were both chilled, both calm, didn't stress me out. It was just a lovely day's ride. Nice chats and nice sitting and chewing the cud. And I was also so pleased to fulfil a promise I'd made to Mark's late wife, Margot, that he could come with me on the ride. I fell in love with Yorkshire's coast all over again, but that love diminished somewhat on the last 2 days of the ride, with day-long bursts of heavy rain that spoiled my planned ride to Spurred Point, and also saw me finishing the ride at the Humber Bridge in torrential rain, which annoyingly started with only a couple of miles left to ride. Just sod's law, isn't it? I reckon that cycling the ride in stages made sure that it never became a chore, so I was really pleased about that. I really loved every day on the bike. Whatever the weather and whatever came my way, the challenge each day simply added to the experience. I loved not knowing what was round the next bend, and at the same time knowing where I was heading to each day. I think I found the right balance between achieving the miles each day to keep the ride moving forward, and at the same time making sure I stopped to take it all in, have an ice cream, have a beer or a chat, taking unplanned detours and excursions to explore away from the planned route, and to capture and enjoy all those wow moments along the way. The overall mileage for the ride was around 4,200 miles, 6,800 kilometres, with 182,300 feet of climbing. That's 55,500 metres, I think, in 101 days of cycling, and raising so far £13,000 for Motor Neurone Disease Association. Each stage was so different, other than, of course, having the sea on my left-hand side. Each stage tested me, both physically and also mentally. Riding alone is lovely, with only myself to please, but it can be lonely unless you make yourself stop and chat to folk. And people quickly became a very important part of the ride for me. Over 75% of campsite owners donated the campsite fees to MNDA. Such kindness and generosity of spirit was shown by everybody I came across. It really blew me away. A chat with a stranger on a bench as you gaze out to sea is an absolute tonic for the soul and a real joy. And it was a privilege to listen to the stories of people's lives in a moment in time and to feel that I might have just touched their lives in some little way. I was really humbled every day of the ride by donations from family, friends, strangers and fellow cyclists. I often found myself welling up at the kindness of strangers as I rode round the coast of Britain. It was an absolute fantastic adventure. There's so much more to tell about each stage of the ride, the highs and the lows, the great achievements and the experiences, and perhaps they're for another time. You can get into the daily posts, stories and photographs for the whole ride on Facebook and Instagram at Neal's, Neals, Neal's Bike Round Britain. And if you'd like to donate to MNDA, the Just Giving page is still up and running, Neal's Bike Round Britain. Thanks very much for listening.
I'm having to be very patient this morning, just waiting for the sun to burn through the thick mist, not particularly at ground level, but above us in the sky, and it's still pretty nippy. It's about 8:30, I think. The sheep and their lambs are being fed by the farmer over there on my left, on the side of the hill, and I'm just waiting for the coffee shop to open at the campsite. I've had my own coffee, but I need another one, accompanied by perhaps a bit of bread or a croissant or whatever they sell. And then it's a case of, heading north, back to Burnsall, Grassington, have a potter around Grassington. I wonder if they're filming, actually. It's where they film all creatures great and small. And I know that they're filming this spring, so you never know, might end up as an extra. And then further north, before looping back down to Appletreewick for a second night in the tent. The sun finally did burst through, although it's still quite hazy, and it's not yet the blue sky that we had yesterday, but it is very, very nice for cycling. Barely any wind, only wind really when you're cycling. I paused in Burnsall for a bacon butter. That seems to be the theme of breakfast for this little mini trip. And then after a few minutes just looking at the map, headed to Hebden and then Grassington, and I've just left Grassington, continuing to follow the wharf north. At some point I'll turn back and head back to Appletreewick. But it is a fantastic day for cycling. Another pause in Grassington to go to the hardware shop. There's an amazing hardware shop in Grassington, and I was delighted to discover it hasn't been commandeered by a bistro or a James Herriot themed experience. It's still there. I've been there before to buy something obscure. I can't remember what. I think last time it was something to do with gas, because I'd run out of something, and they supplied me, and this morning they supplied me with 3 fantastic clips, in fact 4, but I'm using 3 of them to clip the map to the front of the bike, and they are perfect, absolutely perfect, until that is I hit a bump and one of them drops off, but hopefully that won't happen. So I'm not sure where I'll end up next. Looking at the map, which is now clipped to the front of the bike, somewhere north. Morning. But where that is, I'm not actually sure. In fact, it goes over the side of the map, which is why I can't give you a name. I'll report back later. By lunchtime I'd arrived in Kettlewell, and I paused for lunch, to buy lunch, a sausage roll, a banana and a can of Coke at the general stores in Kettlewell, an amazing place that sold almost everything, especially if you're into your art and your crafting. But Kettlewell, crucially, was the bit of my journey which was on the edge of the map. Even Kettlewell was over the map slightly. So I asked for advice from the chap who ran the shop, and he said, well, continue further north and you'll get to Buckden, where there's a nice pub. But the problem is there's only one road, and you can hear why that's a problem because of the traffic. Lots and lots of cars, compared to this morning when really the road from Grassington all the way to Kettlewell was deserted, almost deserted. I had it to myself, just me and a few of the cyclists and the very occasional car. That wasn't the case this afternoon. That's because there are 2 roads basically, one on the east side of the valley, which I was taking, and one on the west side, which is the one that the majority of the cars take, that passes just under Kilnsea Crag. But anyway, got it as far as Buckden, had a pint of light beer and a rest, and have turned round and I'm cycling into the sun back in the direction of Kettlewell, and I'll stick to that quiet road from Kettlewell all the way back down to Grassington, where I'll have another wander. I think I didn't really stay very long in Grassington. I think it's probably worthy of another wander, and then back to Appletreewick later in the afternoon. So as another car rushes past, I think this is the perfect time to have the third and final monologue of this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast.
Hi, I'm Richard Jeffries, and together with Cath and Jules, here's a story about our Land's End John O'Groats ride in the winter over Christmas and New Year 2008 to 2009.
Hi, I'm Cath. Warning: no shelter for 25 miles. Route can be impassable, even in good weather. This is the warning that welcomes cyclists to the bike route before they summit the Dromocta Pass in Scotland. It was also an invitation to adventure, and when we cycled past it in the summer of 2008, my first thought was, that looks fun. And that thought then turned into, wouldn't it be even more fun to ride this in the winter? I was planning to go touring alone the following year, and I wanted a shakedown ride to check the bike and fitness before heading off. Putting these two ideas together, Land's End to John O'Groats in the winter, or Le Winter Jog, was born.
When Cath suggested the idea of Land's End to John O'Groats in the winter, I must admit I was a bit sceptical. Having ridden LEJOG myself in 1998, in the summer, I knew it wasn't easy. The British weather can be hard work, even in the normal touring months from April to October. But in the winter, I wasn't sure about this, so we did some research. Someone must have done this before, we reasoned. This was in 2008, so we asked on the UK Cycling Forum. If someone had done it before, it wasn't obvious. Some replies were cautiously supportive, but most people were of the "I'm not sure that's a good idea" nature, and certainly no one said they'd done it before. Before we set off, we had several questions. First, how do we keep our hands and feet dry when it's cold and rainy for days? Then there was day length. The days would be much shorter than a normal cycle touring day, and this was before the really good LED lights we have nowadays. So how would we manage when it was dark? Where would we stay? We usually camp, but most campsites are shut during the winter. Then there was route planning. Having cycled the route before, I was keen to avoid major roads, particularly at night. Mobile phones were a thing in 2008, but smartphones were still new, and Google Maps wasn't in common use. So firstly, we got help. We recruited our friend Jules, who is always up for adventure, the more challenging the better. Together we worked out a rough route, asking all our friends, and friends of friends, if 3 tired, hungry, and probably wet cyclists could stay a night. Surprisingly, quite a few people said yes, and that gave us the bones of a route. I then stitched together the detail along small roads using maps from the local library.
I'm Jules, and I was really excited to be asked to join this adventure. On the 21st of December 2008, we got on the train to Penzance, and then began the ride from Land's End. It was really mild weather, but one small problem was that the photo thing at Land's End was shut. Nobody was about to take our picture, but we improvised with a timer, and off we set. Starting on the shortest day of the year meant daylight faded by mid-afternoon, and by 5 p.m. it was totally dark. By today's standards, our bike lights were pretty poor. They gave thin points of light that would illuminate a few feet in front, but no more. But we managed. I remember dusk setting in and then riding past houses with Christmas decorations and the mist settling on the fields and valleys before we arrived at a friend's parents' house in Bodmin around 7 p.m. The next day we rode across Bodmin Moor to Tiverton and a travel lodge, where we met up with some other friends for an evening and discovered that the festive period is an excellent time to ride a long way because everywhere serves huge calorific piles of Christmas dinner, which makes for perfect cycling fodder. We decorated our bikes with tinsel to celebrate. We aimed to set off early each day before sunrise and reached our destinations invariably several hours after night fell. We stopped with friends along the way, and we arrived on Christmas Eve at my parents'. Boxing Day was cold and frosty, and we briefly paused to help a sheep that had got its head stuck in a fence before riding through a largely deserted Oxford city centre to camp somewhere in Northamptonshire.
A day later brought us to Pete's family home in Nottingham, which was fortunate because Jules' back wheel had started to have problems, and the following day we spent a while sourcing a new rear wheel from a rally dealer in the city. Having fixed the bike, we headed north, staying in a travel lodge next to the A1, where we found almost nothing to eat except Weetabix and days-old meat pasties. It had been raining a lot, and through York the River Ouse was covering the cycle path. Despite Jules telling us that we'd definitely be okay to continue, a few hundred metres out of town we had to turn back as the water was creeping up to beyond our hubs. North Yorkshire was surprisingly flat and easy. I remember green fields and views of Drax power station, and we rocked up at another friend's house in Northallerton. They were so lovely, but we discovered they didn't really know about the extreme calorific requirements of 3 cyclists who had been riding for about 10 hours. Their nut roast was delicious, but also modest, and given how far we'd cycled, we could have done with several each, rather than just one to share. I remember going to our room and raiding our supply of granola bars that evening. The further north we went, the hillier it got, and the shorter the days became too. Each day we typically spent hours riding after dark along A roads. The ones near Hexham are especially burned into my memory. Each time I heard a car coming up behind us at about 60 miles an hour in the dark, I did expect calamity, but it was fine. I think the sight of 3 cyclists out at night startled drivers enough to give us a wide berth.
From Hexham, the hills got bigger. On New Year's Eve, we rode up past Kielder Water, and instead of a glass of bubbly, we shared a champagne truffle our nut roast friends had kindly given us before crossing the Scottish border. We wild camped, pitching our tents under pine trees, and were happily snuggled into our sleeping bags by about 7 p.m. It was chucking it down with rain that night, and we woke up after midnight to hear the distant fireworks.
New Year in Scotland is quite a festivity, so it was a little tricky to find somewhere for breakfast, but we found an open cafe in Hoyk and hoovered up as much grub as we could before reaching Edinburgh, again after dark. But this time it was easier because we lived there and knew all the bike routes. It was great to be home and able to wash and dry our kit. The next day we met Pete from Nottingham again, this time to join us for a few days as we rode north. As we crossed the Forth Bridge, it began to snow, and by the time we were level with Loch Leven, lorries were struggling to get up inclines. The snow added both new challenges and great beauty. We arrived at our friend Ellie's flat in Perth that evening to nearly a foot of snow. Luckily, Ellie's partner had made what still counts as the most excellent slow-cooked beef and Guinness stew I've ever had. I can still remember how the beef melted in the mouth. We were a bit concerned about the next few days. The Dromocta Pass is the highest and one of the wildest parts of the route. The warning sign is right. There isn't any shelter, not even in summer, much less when there's over a foot of snow on the ground. However, off we set, initially to Mike's house in Pitlochry. We arrived to find he'd booted his teenage kids out and given us both their rooms and their dinner, which he had to cook on the wood burner because electricity was off due to the blizzard. We bought wellies and welly boot socks to ride in for the next few days. The next day we set off in the deep snow, riding sometimes along a slushy A9 and then onto the cycle track. We found immediately that going was tough. The highways people quite sensibly assumed that nobody would be using the cycle track and hadn't cleared it. So we rode through and occasionally fell into a foot or so of snow. Our bikes were standard touring bikes with mud guards and wide road tyres and rim brakes. Snow began accumulating on the rims and spokes, getting stuck in the brakes and mudguards, making every pedal stroke even harder than it should have been, with a fully laden touring bike uphill over the Dromocta Pass. Pete nobly lent his bike, a mountain bike, to me. We pushed and struggled. It was exceptionally hard. After a couple of hours of this torment, when I thought I'd about had enough, Pete memorably said, in bright, breathless tones, "This is a bit physical, isn't it?" Which was just what we needed to spur us on. Eventually, late in the day, we made it over the summit, staying that night in Aviemore Youth Hostel.
All the gritty, snowy braking had taken its toll, though, and this time it was my rear wheel that developed an ominous wobble, and on closer inspection I found that this was because the slush had ground away at my rim, wearing it thin enough to bend. Luckily, we found a bike shop in Aviemore that could replace my whole rear wheel, though I cut out the hub to rebuild for another day and still have it somewhere. The next day was bright, but very cold. Large sheets of meltwater formed over the bike path, making riding very treacherous. Falling off happened a lot, although Jules managed to avoid it more than me and Cath. That night, we reached Inverness after dark, rode across the bridge to the Black Isle, and took a 5-mile diversion to stay at a holiday home owned by some work friends, arriving in sub-zero temperatures. It was no longer snowy, just very cold.
Our final couple of days were just as memorable. We wild camped one Baltic night near Helmsdale, and I logged a half-a-dead tree up from a nearby ditch to make a warm fire, but it was too cold and wet to get it started. It was so cold that our water bottles on the floor had started to freeze, and as Rich got up from the sleeping mat he was sitting on, he realised he'd left a backside-shaped outline behind on the mat. The rest of the mat was covered in frost.
The final day was a little milder, and we finally reached John O'Groats, surprisingly before dark fell. Again, nobody was around to take a photo, though the ladies in the visitor office were quite surprised at cyclists arriving from Land's End in early January. They said that nobody had arrived later than November or before February before. Can't think why. As we look back on the ride now, which was 16 years ago today, we enjoy remembering it together, cycling through floods, over mountains and across the ice, meeting old friends and making new friends and being together with friends. We felt proud showing our children the pictures and sometimes tell them stories about it, inspiring them to take on their own adventures. It was as hard as it was amazing. As Pete said, it was a bit physical.
Saturday morning, out of breath, having done what I didn't plan on doing. Nothing to do with the park run, that's still to come. I did plan on actually taking a flat route back to Skipton, but in the end I thought, nah, I've just got to get back there as quickly as possible. So I was up at 6:15, tent packed, off the campsite by 7 a.m, and basically I got an hour and a half to get to the park in Skipton where the park run is. It was freezing. My fingers were frozen several times even before I'd left the campsite. Courtesy of the hand dryer, I managed to warm them up. But that's one advantage of having climbed the hill that I've just climbed, 2 kilometres of it. The blood was pumping round my body and I'm back to feeling nice and warm. I just hope that in the downhill section between here and Skipton I don't freeze again. The sun is out, it's a beautiful blue sky, nothing like yesterday, no cloud to speak of, in fact no cloud, just a bit of haze in the distance. It is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I wish I could stand here for half an hour and just gaze at it. But one, I don't want to freeze, so I need to keep moving, and secondly, I need to get to Skipton in the next 45 minutes, get changed, ready for that run at 9 o'clock around the park in Skipton, if I can find it. There's a question. It's now Sunday afternoon, and I made it home after my little trip to the Dales. Hope you enjoyed listening to how I got on. I did make it to the park run in Skipton, and it was a bit of a hilly course. It was either uphill or downhill, and a lot tougher than the one in Greenhead Park in Huddersfield. My time yesterday was 28 minutes and 4 seconds. I don't think there was ever any risk of me beating my Huddersfield PB of 26 minutes and 49 seconds, which was only set last week, but there we go. Anyway, this is not a podcast about park runs. This is a podcast about cycling. Just one last thing about the park run, and that's that I had a really interesting chat with a chap called James Dean. He'd seen some of my posts on Facebook while I was up in the Dales, and because he lives in Skipton, he said, I might bump into you tomorrow. I did bump into him at the park run. We had a good chat, and he was extolling the virtues of going cycling on Mallorca. So I'll put it on the list of things or places to visit. Thank you to all the people who have contributed the monologues. Thank you to Justin Shiels. You can visit the Welcome to My Garden website if you go to welcometomygarden.org. Thank you to Neal Porter. And if you'd like to donate to Neal's chosen charity, which is the MND Association, you can find Neal's page on Just Giving if you search for Neal's Bike Round Britain. Not around Britain, but round Britain. And you can also find him on Instagram. Again, his handle is Neal's Bike Round Britain. Not around Britain, but round Britain. And thank you to Richard, Cath and Jules for telling their story of going cycling in winter. I can kind of sympathise because it did get pretty chilly in the evening and the early mornings when I was in the Dales in the last few days. So, this has been episode 89 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Hopefully you found it interesting, informative, perhaps even inspiring, listening to the tales, certainly of Neal and Richard and Cath. So thank you to all the contributors. If you'd like to get in contact, then you can do so by visiting cyclingeurope.org/contact. And if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can find all the details at cyclingeurope.org/support. So thank you for listening. I'll be back with episode 90 at some point soon, hopefully soon. Don't know when. But thank you for listening. And as always, happy cycling.